The storm flung Fay nunnally through the doors of Oxshott Hall, as though it meant to be rid of her, and she went down hard across the flagstones, her portmanteau bursting open at the feet of a stranger seated by the fire. She heard, before she felt the arms that caught her, the scrape of a chair driven back across stone, a sound the household had not heard in 3 years, and then a voice, low and rough as though long unused to speaking at all, said the only 2 words that would matter for the rest of her life. "You're mine." He did not mean it as any vow. Later she would understand that. In that first instant he had only meant that she had fallen, and he had caught her, and whatever she was, drenched, half-fainted, a stranger blown in on the wind, she was, for that one suspended moment, his to hold and not to drop. But the words themselves did not know their own modesty, and they went into her like a struck bell, ringing long after the sense of them had been explained away. She came back to herself by degrees. First the smell of wood smoke and wet wool. Then the hard warmth of a man's chest beneath her cheek, and arms that did not shake though she could feel, distancing her, cost him something, a tightness through his frame, a held breath. She opened her eyes to firelight and to a face bent close over hers. Dark hair gone silver at one temple, though he could not have been much past 35, a jaw set hard against pain, and a scar that cut pale and clean across his brow, disappearing into his hairline as though a blade had once tried to open his skull and been refused. His eyes found hers. They were dark and startled, the eyes of a man caught doing something he had forbidden himself. "Forgive me," he said, and set her on her feet with a care that belied the rawness of a moment before, though she felt him sway as he did it, felt the effort ripple through his arms before he mastered it. "You fell. I did not think, I only—" He did not finish. Behind him, in the doorway to the great hall, a woman in housekeeper's black had gone the colour of tallow. "Your Grace." The word came out of her in a whisper, as though she feared saying it too loud might undo whatever miracle had occurred. "Your Grace, you are standing." The Duke of Oxshott looked down, as if only then discovering the fact himself. For a moment something moved across his face that Fay, still gripping the back of a chair to keep her own trembling legs beneath her, could not name. Not triumph, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of astonished grief, as though he had been shown proof of a country he no longer believed existed. Then it was gone, folded away so quickly she might have imagined it, and he reached for the cane that had fallen with the chair and used it, and the ease was gone out of him. He lowered himself back into the seat with the particular economy of a man who has learned exactly how much a movement will cost him and pays it without complaint, though his knuckles whitened on the cane's silver head. "Mrs. Prewitt." His voice had gone flat and correct, a voice for giving orders, nothing at all like the 2 words he had spoken to Fay a minute before. "See to her. She's soaked through and half frozen, and I've frightened her besides." "You have not frightened me," Fay said before she had decided to speak at all. It was not a wise thing to say to a duke she had known for the length of one fall and one catch. She saw it land on him strangely, saw his eyes come back to her face and stay there a beat too long, as though her words were a coin of foreign mintage he was turning over to determine its worth. "Then you are either very brave, or you have not yet had the leisure to look at me properly," he said, and there was something almost like humour in it, dry and self-mocking, though his mouth did not move to match it. "Mrs. Prewitt will remedy that oversight directly, I'm sure, along with the wet and the cold. Go on." It was a dismissal, gentle as such things went, but a dismissal all the same, and Fay found herself steered by the housekeeper's firm hand toward the hall's far door before she could think what else to say. She looked back once. The Duke of Oxshott had already turned his face to the fire, and the line of his shoulders told her, without a single word more, that the door he had opened a crack had just been shut again, and shut hard. She had come to Oxshott because her father was dead and her father's living had gone to another man with children of his own to feed, and because a letter had come from a Lady Millicent Ashcombe, on to the Duke of Oxshott, seeking a companion of good sense and quiet manner, wages paid quarterly, situation permanent if suited. Fay had read the letter 3 times over by candlelight in the vicarage's cold front room, and then she had written back. Because a permanent situation was not a thing offered twice to a parson's daughter of 26 with no fortune, and no particular beauty to recommend her, Only a steady hand and a habit of kindness that had never yet done her any material good. The coach had brought her as far as the crossroads below the moor before the driver had flatly refused to go on, storm or no storm, wages or no wages. And Faye had walked the last mile herself in the dark, with her portmanteau growing heavier with every step, and the rain coming sideways off the hills like something with intent, by the time Oxshott Hall rose up out of the murk. A great black shoulder of stone with perhaps 3 windows lit in the whole of its long face. She had been beyond deciding whether to knock properly or simply throw herself at the door, and in the end the door had made the decision for her. Opening under a gust just as her numbed feet betrayed her on the wet step. She had not expected to fall into a duke. She certainly had not expected the duke to rise. Mrs. Pruitt walked her now down a corridor hung with portraits gone dim with age and neglect, talking all the while in the brisk undertone of a woman managing her own shock by outrunning it. A hot bath, dry things. One of the upstairs maids was near enough Faye's size. Something to eat, for she looked fit to fall down again, and no mistake, and no wonder, walking the moor road in weather like this. Whatever had possessed the coachman to abandon her at the crossroads? Mrs. Pruitt, Faye said, when the housekeeper paused at last for breath, is it, does his grace not walk? I did not mean to presume, only you seemed so. He does not, Mrs. Pruitt said, and something closed in her face, careful and guarded, the look of a woman deciding how much truth a stranger had earned. Not without his cane, and rarely even then, and never in 3 years, has he risen from that chair of his own will to catch a falling body out of the air. He has a man to lift him should he need lifting, and he takes his meals in that room, and he receives no one, and he goes nowhere. And I have kept this house through all of it, and I will tell you plainly, because you will hear it from someone before the week is out, and better it come from me. The servants below stairs call him the beast of Oxshott, though not where I can hear it, and the village calls him worse. And none of it is fair, and none of it is his fault, but there it is. What happened to him? Mrs. Pruitt's mouth thinned. Waterloo happened to him, miss. Grape shot took him through the hip and the leg both, and a sabre opened his head besides, and they carried him home more dead than living, and it was 8 months before he could sit a chair without weeping from the pain of it, though he'd sooner have died than let anyone see that. His brother died in the same charge, went down not 10 feet from him, and the Duke could not so much as crawl to him, do you understand, could not move at all, and had to lie there in the mud and watch. He does not speak of it. No one in this house speaks of it. And the lady he was to marry, Mrs. Pruitt caught herself visibly and shook her head. That is not my tale to tell. Here is your room. I'll send up the water directly. Faye stood a long moment after the housekeeper's footsteps had faded, looking at nothing, turning the story over. Grape shot and a sabre and a brother dead in the mud and a fiancée who had, what? Left him. She did not need Mrs. Pruitt to finish that sentence. The shape of it was plain enough in the shape of everything else, in a house with 3 lit windows and a man who took his meals alone and would not be seen. She thought of the arms that had caught her. She had felt no monster in them. She had felt a man holding himself together by main force, the way a beam holds a roof, silently at cost, because the alternative was collapse. A girl of perhaps 17 came in with the hot water, bobbed a nervous curtsy, and would not quite meet Faye's eye until Faye had thanked her twice and asked her name. Nell, miss, if it please you. The girl set down her cans and lingered, curiosity plainly warring with training. Is it true, miss, begging your pardon, is it true his grace came up out of his chair to catch you? Only Tom the footman swears it, and I told him he was telling tales, for his grace hasn't stood on his own in an age, not since the winter he tried the stairs and Dr. Alcott had to be sent for after, and there was such a to-do below stairs that no one dared mention it above a whisper for a month. It is true, Faye said, working the pins from her wet hair with fingers still not quite steady, though I do not think he meant to do it. I think it happened before he could stop himself. That's just it, miss. Nell dropped her voice, glancing at the door as though the walls themselves might carry tales upward. He stops himself from everything now. Won't be helped up the stairs in front of anyone but Sims. Won't have his dinner in the hall where the family portraits can look down on him. Won't so much as open a letter of condolence, though Lord knows enough of them came after the master died. That's his brother, I mean, miss, the young lord, killed at the same battle. His grace was a different man before it, they say. Laughed loud enough to be heard in the stable-yard. I never knew him so myself. I only started here after, but the older staff remember, and they say it like they're grieving a second death. The man he was. Fay said nothing to that, only nodded. And let the girl chatter on a while longer about the household, the aunt Lady Millicent, who kept mostly to her rooms and would be glad of company, the physician who called twice weekly and no oftener, now the worst of the wound had healed, though a stiffness and a grinding pain remained that no medicine had ever quite reached. The strict rule, understood by all though never precisely spoken, that no one below stairs was to remark on his grace's leg, or his stick, or his scar, or anything at all that might remind him a stranger had looked at him and seen the marks the war had left. It was, Fay thought after Nell had gone, a very careful sort of kindness the whole house had built around him, and a very lonely one, for kindness that dares not speak its name is little different, in the end, from silence. The bath was hot, and the borrowed nightgown was soft, and the fire in her small grate burned steady, and still Fay could not sleep. She lay watching shadows move on the ceiling and found her mind returning, again and again, to the 2 words he had said, and to the astonished grief that had crossed his face when he understood he was standing, near midnight, unable to bear her own wakefulness a moment longer. She rose and wrapped herself in the shawl Mrs. Pruitt had left and went looking for water, or for the library Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned in passing, or perhaps, though she would not have admitted this even to herself, for some proof that the evening's strange collision had truly happened, and was not a fever dream brought on by cold and exhaustion. She found the Duke instead. He was in the long gallery, alone, a single branch of candles burning on the table beside him, and he was not seated. He stood at the tall window with one hand braced against the frame, and the cane hanging forgotten from his other wrist, looking out a night that offered nothing to look at, only black glass and his own reflection thrown back at him twice over. Fay stopped in the doorway, her candle throwing her shadow long across the floor between them, and he turned too fast. She saw at once a turn that cost him, for he had to catch himself hard against the window frame and his breath went short with it, and for one unguarded second his face was entirely open, entirely undefended, and what she saw there was not a beast and was not even pain, precisely. It was loneliness so old it had stopped announcing itself as anything at all, and had simply become the shape of the room he lived in. "You should be abed," he said, once he had mastered himself, once the shutters had come down again behind his eyes. "So should you, your grace." She did not move away, though every sensible instinct told her a woman alone with a man of his rank at midnight, in her night clothes, was a scandal waiting only for a witness. Something in his face kept her feet planted. I could not sleep for thinking of it. "Of you standing." It was nothing, a reflex. A man does not let a body fall in front of him without. He stopped, his jaw worked. "It will not happen again. You need not fear that I make a habit of leaping from chairs, Miss Nunnerly. Mrs. Pruitt has told you my situation, I expect, in whatever careful language she uses to frighten new girls into gentleness with me. She has told me you were wounded at Waterloo. She did not call you a beast. Others do, I understand, but not her. And not to your face, I'd wager, and not." Fay drew a breath, astonished at her own boldness, unable to stop it now that it had begun. "Not I, your grace, whatever anyone else may say of you below stairs or in the village. I saw a man catch a falling stranger, though it cost him to do it. That is the whole of what I know of you, and it does not want to sit alongside the word beast in my mind. The 2 will not fit together, however I turn them." For a long moment he only looked at her, and the candlelight moved on the scar at his brow, and somewhere in the depths of the house a clock struck the half-hour, thin and far away. "You are either very brave," he said at last, echoing his own words from the hall, "or you have not yet had the leisure to know better. Go to bed, Miss Nunnerly. Tomorrow this house will teach you which it is." He turned back to the window before she could answer. And though she stood a moment longer, she understood the audience was ended, and there was nothing left to do but go, carrying the candle and the cold and the strange, stubborn warmth of his 2 first words back to her room with her, where they would keep her, she suspected, from any real sleep at all. Morning at Oxshott arrived grey and reluctant, and Duke Eamon woke, as he always woke, to the particular ache that lived in his hip and travelled down through the ruined muscle of his thigh like a slow-burning fuse, and to the memory, sharper this morning than it had been in years, of a woman's weight against his chest and the astonishment of his own 2 legs holding beneath him. He lay still a long while, testing the memory the way his tongue might test a sore tooth, waiting for it to hurt in the familiar way and finding, instead, that it did not hurt at all. That frightened him more than the pain ever had. He rang for Sims, dressed with the valet's silent, practiced help, and was in his chair by the window with correspondence he had no intention of answering spread untouched across his lap, when Mrs. Pruitt came to report, as she reported every morning, on the running of a house he no longer troubled himself to see. "The new companion is settled, your grace. Miss Nunnally. She'll begin with Lady Millicent this morning once her ladyship wakes." Mrs. Pruitt hesitated, which was unlike her. She was not a woman given to hesitating. "She asked after you, whether you'd want anything sent up." "I want nothing sent up, so I told her." A pause. "She has a gentle way about her, your grace, if I may say so. Not missish. Didn't so much as blink at the girl's whole account of the household. I am not asking your opinion of her manners, Mrs. Pruitt." "No, your grace." But the housekeeper did not go, and something in her stillness made him look up at last from the letters he was not reading. "Only I thought you'd want to know she means to call on you directly, once she's paid her respects to Lady Millicent. Says she wishes to thank you properly." "I told her you don't receive callers." "And what did she say to that?" "She said, your grace, that she wasn't calling, she was returning a courtesy." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth twitched, very nearly a smile. "I couldn't find fault with the logic, so I've let her come." He should have refused it outright. He knew that even as he said nothing, even as Mrs. Pruitt took his silence for the permission it was and left him alone with the fire and the useless letters and the memory of his own arms not shaking beneath a stranger's weight, he had built, over 3 careful years, a wall high enough that no one troubled to climb it any more. Not Wexford, who had stopped calling after the 4th refusal. Not the vicar, who sent his good wishes by note and never in person. Not even his aunt, who lived under his roof and rarely left her rooms before noon. As though she too had absorbed the house's unspoken law that the Duke was a thing to be managed gently from a distance, like weather. He had not expected the wall to have a door in it. He had certainly not expected a soaked, half-fainting stranger to find it in her first hour beneath his roof. She came at 11, exactly as she had said she would, and knocked. Actually knocked, waited to be bid enter, which no one in this house bothered to do any more, having long since learned he would say nothing either way. He said nothing this time either, out of some contrary instinct to test whether she would go away. She did not go away. She knocked again, and when he still gave no answer, opened the door regardless and stood in it with her chin set at an angle he was beginning, in the space of one day, to recognize. "You did not say I might come in," she observed, "but you did not say I might not, and Mrs. Pruitt assures me those are quite different things where you're concerned. Mrs. Pruitt exceeds her authority. She is very fond of you. It makes her braver than she'd otherwise be." Fay came further into the room without waiting for leave, and he watched her take in the space, the drawn curtains at 2 of the 3 windows, the cold hearth on the room's far side, where no fire had been lit in longer than he could remember, the untouched stack of correspondence, the general air of a lived-in by a man determined to need nothing from it. She did not comment on any of it. That too he noticed. "I came to thank you, your grace, and then I shall go and trouble you no further today." "You need not thank me for catching what I nearly knocked down. You did not knock me down. The storm did that. You only kept me for raking my neck on your flagstones, which I understand cost you rather more than it appeared to." Her eyes went, briefly, to the cane propped against his chair, and then, without flinching, to the scar at his brow, and then, most disconcertingly of all, simply to his face, as though the rest of him were no more remarkable than anyone else's coat. "I wished to say so properly. Thank you, your grace." He found he did not know to answer a thanks so plainly given, with no piety folded inside it and no horror either. He had grown so accustomed to receiving one or the other, Dr. Alcott's clinical concern, Mrs. Pruitt's careful management, the memory worse than either, of Cassandra's face the first time she had seen him after they carried him home, the way her composure had cracked for one unguarded second, before she mustered it into something gentler and far more devastating, pity, that gratitude, offered without either of those currencies attached, left him with nothing to push against. "You are welcome," he said finally, which was inadequate, and he knew it was inadequate, and could think of nothing better. "Was there anything else, Miss Nunnally?" "Only a question, if you'll permit it, and then I truly will go." She did not wait for permission, which he was coming to understand was simply her way. "Do you never leave this room?" "I fail to see how that concerns you." "It doesn't, particularly. I only wondered." "Because Lady Millicent tells me you used to ride out every morning before the war, rain or shine, and that you were reckoned the best horseman in 3 counties, and I find it strange that a man who once loved the open air so well should now sit with the curtains drawn on a fine morning." "Lady Millicent talks a great deal for a woman who has known you one day. She is lonely, your grace, same as—" Faye stopped herself, visibly, colour rising in her cheeks, and he understood exactly what she had not said and admired her, despite himself for not saying it. "Same as I am." "You may finish the sentence, Miss Nunnally. I am not so delicate as the household seems to believe." "I did not think you delicate," she said with some heat. "I think you angry and in pain, and shut up in this room like a man serving a sentence for a crime he didn't commit. And I think the whole house tiptoes around you so carefully that no one has told you the truth in 3 years, which is that you are not the only man who ever came home from a war changed, and you are certainly not the only man who ever lost a brother, and grief is no crime either, however long a man serves it." The silence that followed was total. He watched her realize, a beat too late, what she had said and to whom she had said it, watched the colour drain as fast as it had risen, watched her open her mouth, to apologize, he supposed, to retreat behind the proper distances of governess and duke that she had, until that moment, so thoroughly ignored. He spoke before she could. "No one has spoken to me like that," he said slowly, "since my brother died. I am sorry. That was not my place. I did not say it was unwelcome." He looked at her, at the colour still high in her cheeks, at the stubborn set of a jaw far too determined for a woman who had walked a more road alone in a storm rather than fail at the one situation offered her. "You are the first person under this roof, Miss Nunnally, who has spoken to me as though I might still be capable of resenting my own confinement, rather than a man to be humoured out of it gently, like a child or an invalid. I find I do not know what to do with that. I am not certain I dislike it. That is, I think, the closest thing to a compliment you have paid me, your grace. Do not grow used to it." But something had eased in his voice, some fraction of the guard come down, and she saw it, he could tell she saw it, and did not press further, only inclined her head and turned to go, pausing once more at the door. "I am to read to Lady Millicent every afternoon at 4, she said. "She tells me you used to like Mr. Scott's poems before. If ever you found yourself curious what a bad reader makes of good verse, my door," that is her door, "will be open." She was gone before he could answer, which he suspected was deliberate, a woman leaving a door ajar rather than pushing him through it. He sat a long while after, looking at the cold hearth, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to measure, thinking of 4 o'clock as something other than another hour to be endured. He did not go. He told himself at 3:30 that it was foolishness, that a duke did not creep along his own corridors to eavesdrop on his aunt's companion reading verse aloud, that whatever strange though the previous evening's collision had worked in him would pass, as all such thaws passed, back into the familiar ice of ordinary days. At 5 minutes to 4 he found himself, cane in hand, standing outside his aunt's sitting room regardless, listening through the door to a voice reading Marmion with more feeling than technical polish, exactly as she had promised. And he stood there a full quarter hour before he could persuade himself either to enter or to leave, and in the end did neither, only stood in the cold corridor with his hand on the doorframe and his eyes closed, listening to a stranger's voice fill a house that had been silent, in every way that mattered, for 3 long years. Sims found him there eventually and said nothing, only offered his arm for the walk back, and Eamon took it without argument, too unsettled by his own conduct to muster the pride that would ordinarily have refused the help. Behind him, faint through the door, he could still hear her voice, and he carried the sound of it with him all the way back to his cold room, where he sat a long while by the dead hearth and, for the first time in 3 years, rang for a fire to be lit. Lady Millicent Ashcombe was 71 years old, half-deaf in one ear, and possessed of an unsparing clarity of mind that age had done nothing to dull. She listened to Fay read for the better part of an hour, correcting her pronunciation of a Scots word twice and complimenting her feeling for the metre once. And when the reading was done, she set down her needlework and studied her new companion with the frank appraisal of a woman who did not believe in wasting time on pleasantries when a more useful conversation was available. "You've met my nephew, then," she said. "Is not a question." "Last evening, my lady, rather dramatically, I'm afraid. So Pruitt tells me. The whole house is talking of nothing else, that he came up out of his chair like a man half his age and caught you before you struck the floor." Lady Millicent's needle paused over her work. "Do you know, Miss Nunneley, in 3 years I have not seen him stand of his own will, except when Alcott has made him, for the exercises the doctor swears will keep the muscle from seizing entire, and even then only with Sims at one arm and a great deal of grinding of teeth. He will not be seen to struggle. He would rather sit still than let anyone watch him fail to rise gracefully, and so mostly he simply does not rise at all. Why, my lady, if I may ask? Dr. Alcott's exercises, surely with time." "Oh, the leg would serve him better than it does, I've no doubt, if he troubled himself. It is not entirely the leg that keeps him in that chair, Miss Nunneley, whatever he tells himself and whatever the household is too tactful to say aloud. It is easier to be a cripple by choice than to try and fail, and be watched failing by people who once knew you whole." The old woman's eyes, pale blue and shrewd, fixed on Fay with sudden intensity. "You did not flinch from him. Pruitt told me that too. Most who see him for the first time cannot govern their faces quite so well, whatever their good manners. There is always a flicker, a half-second before the manners arrive to smooth it over, and he sees it every time, however fast it comes and goes. He has become very expert at watching for that flicker. I did not feel any flicker to govern, my lady. I only saw a man in pain who had chosen, in spite of the pain, to catch me rather than let me fall." Something in Lady Millicent's face softened, the shrewdness giving way briefly to something gentler and more tired. "There was a young woman once, you understand, who was to have married him. Lady Cassandra Hale, as she was then, a earl's daughter, very lovely, very accomplished, and by all accounts genuinely fond of him before the war. She came to see him when they brought him home. I was in the room. I will not soon forget it. The old woman's hands had gone still over her work entirely now. She did not scream or swoon or do anything so dramatic as that. She only looked at him, at the leg, and the wound still open across his brow, and the grey already come into his hair, though he was but 32, and something went out of her face, Miss Nunneley. Some warmth simply extinguished itself before our eyes, though she smiled and said all the correct, kind things a moment later. He saw it. Of course he saw it. He has spent his whole life since noticing exactly that flicker in every face turned toward him. She broke the engagement within the month, very properly, very regretfully, citing his need for quiet and recovery rather than the burden of a wife, and married Lord Wexford's cousin the following spring, and my nephew has not fully risen from that chair since, in any sense of the word, until you came blown in out of the storm and gave him no time to remember he wasn't meant to." Fay sat very still, the poetry book closed in her lap, and found she had no ready words for what the old woman had just laid before her, only a slow, quiet anger on his behalf, and beneath the anger, something warmer and far more dangerous, a tenderness she had not invited and could not, she suspected, easily unfeel now that it had taken root. "That is a cruel story, my lady. It is a very ordinary one, I'm afraid, dressed up in a coronet. The world does not much care for men who no longer walk as they once did, Miss Nunneley, however bravely they bled to earn the limp. It prefers its heroes whole or else safely dead and mourned in marble. My nephew is neither, and so the world has mostly decided to look elsewhere, and he has helped it along by locking his own door." Lady Millicent took up her needlework again, though her hands were not quite steady. "I tell you this not to gossip, child, Because I watched your face just now when you spoke of him, and I am an old woman with little enough left to occupy me besides the correct reading of other people's hearts, and I flatter myself I read yours rightly. Be careful. Not of him. I do not think there is a gentler man alive under that scowl of his, whatever the village says, but of what it will cost you to care for a man the whole world has agreed to pity from a safe distance. Pity is comfortable. It asks nothing of the one who feels it. What you are already beginning to feel, my dear, asks a good deal more, and I do not know that Oxshott has enough courage left in him to accept it, whatever courage he once had in such abundance on a battlefield. Fay said nothing for a long moment, turning the book over in her hands. Then I shall have to be patient, my lady, she said at last. I find I am not much afraid of asking a great deal of a person, if the person is worth it. Lady Millicent looked at her for a long moment, and then unexpectedly smiled, the first real smile Fay had seen on her since arriving. No, she said softly, I don't suppose you are at that. Within a fortnight the fire in Eamon's grate had become a fixture rather than an event, and Sims had stopped remarking on it, and the curtains at the third window stayed open past noon more days than not, and none of it, Eamon told himself, had anything whatsoever to do with the fact that Fay Nunnally had taken to reading aloud in the library at 4 o'clock instead of his aunt's sitting room, on the thin pretext that the light was better there, and that he had taken to being in the library himself at 4 o'clock. On the thinner pretext that he had correspondence to attend to. Neither of them remarked on the arrangement. Both of them kept it day after day, with the careful non-acknowledgement of two people building something neither is yet brave enough to name. You read Cowper very ill, he told her one afternoon, when she had murdered a stanza badly enough that he could not hold his tongue. You put the emphasis where the sense wants it, not where the metre wants it. It is meant to be sung, Miss Nunnally, not recited like a sermon. Then perhaps your Grace would care to demonstrate, since he is so free with his criticism and so stingy with his corrections. It was a challenge plainly meant as one, and he saw her watching to see whether he would take it, whether the Duke of Oxshott, who had not read aloud to another living soul since before the war, would open his mouth in front of a witness and risk whatever unsteadiness 3 years of silence had worked into his voice. He held her gaze a moment, weighing it, and then held out his hand for the book. His voice, when he began, was rough at first, uncertain of its own instrument, and then it found itself, the old cadence returning as though it had merely been sleeping and not, as he had believed, buried beyond recovery, and he read the whole of the stanza and the one following it besides. And when he looked up, Fay's eyes were bright with something that was not quite triumph and not quite tears, some third thing for which he had no ready name. There, she said softly, that is a voice that used to laugh in the stable-yard loud enough to be heard from the house. I did not think I would ever hear a scrap of it, and here it is, hiding under bad Cowper of all places. He should have deflected that. He had 100 ready deflections, cultivated over 3 years for precisely such moments when someone came too near the man he had been. Instead he found himself saying, "Who told you that, about the stable-yard? Nell, and your aunt, in her way. Everyone in this house remembers you as a man who laughed easily, your Grace, and grieves that they no longer hear it, though none of them would ever say so to your face for fear of paining you with the comparison. It pains me regardless whether they say it or not." He set the book down more roughly than he intended. "I know precisely what I was, Miss Nunnally. I do not need reminding of the distance between that man and this one. I did not mean it as a wound." She rose from her chair and came to sit nearer him, near enough that he could smell the faint lavender of the soap she used, near enough that retreat would have required an obvious effort neither of them was willing to make. "I meant it as a comfort. That man is not so buried as you believe. I have heard him twice now, once in your reading and once, your Grace, forgive me for saying it, in the hall on the night I fell, when you called for Mrs. Pruitt in a voice that still knew how to command a room without flinching. He is in there. He has simply forgotten the way out, and you fancy yourself his guide, I collect. I fancy myself no such grand thing." Her chin came up, that same stubborn angle he had marked the very first morning. "I only intend to keep reading Cowper badly enough that you cannot bear to sit silent through it, your Grace, and see where that leads us. Despite himself, he laughed, a short, rusty sound, more surprise than amusement, but a laugh nonetheless, and he saw the effect of it on her face. The quick, unguarded pleasure that told him she had been listening for it, hoping for it, in a way that unsettled him more than any of her boldness had done yet. A woman did not hope so plainly for a broken man's laughter unless she had already begun to care rather more than good sense allowed. He ought to have warned her off then. He told himself so a dozen times over the following days, composed the speech in his head each night before sleep took him, that she was young and kind, and deserved a whole man's devotion rather than a cripple's grudging affection eked out by the fire in a cold library, that whatever warmth had sprung up between them was a kindness on her part and nothing more, and he was a fool and worse than a fool to let himself mistake it for anything deeper. That the kindest thing he could do, the only honourable thing, was to send her back to his aunt's sitting room and keep his 4 o'clock hours to himself, as he had kept every other hour of every other day since Waterloo. He never gave the speech. 4 o'clock came, and he found himself in the library regardless, and told himself each time it would be the last, and it never was. It was Fay who first mentioned the garden, on an evening when the reading had run long and the light through the tall windows had gone the deep gold of late summer. "Lady Millicent tells me there is a rose garden gone entirely to wilderness on the south side," she said, not quite looking at him, turning the pages of the book she was not reading. "She says you planted half of it yourself before, and that no one has touched it since, she'd not say out of what precisely, but I collect no one wished to disturb it without your leave. There was no reason to disturb it. It is only weeds and briar now. I should like to see it regardless, your grace, weeds and all. I have a fondness for gardens that no one tends. They always seem to me to be waiting rather than dying. If someone would only come." He knew what she was asking beneath the words, knew it as surely as he knew the ache that would come with standing and walking the length of the terrace and down the stone steps to where the roses ran wild. Knew, too, that he had not attempted so long a distance unaided in longer than he cared to reckon, and that failure, if it came, would come in front of the one person whose good opinion had somehow, in the space of a few short weeks, become a thing he could not bear to lose. He rose anyway. The distance to the terrace door was nothing, a mutter of a dozen steps. He managed most days regardless. It was the steps down into the garden proper that undid the easy fiction he had been telling himself, 6 worn stone treads gone slick with moss, and he felt his bad leg buckle beneath him on the 3rd one, felt the world tilt sideways in a way that brought back, with sickening suddenness, the memory of mud and grape shot, and the particular helplessness of a body that would not do as it was told. Her hand was under his arm before he had finished falling. Not a grab, not the frantic snatch of panic, but a steady bracing pressure that came from beneath and beside him both. Taking his weight without seeming to strain for it, exactly as she had done in the hall on the day of the fair. Though that day had not yet come, he would think later, marveling at how naturally her body already knew the shape of steadying his. She said nothing at all in the moment itself, only held and waited, until his own legs found their purchase again and the danger passed, and only then did she speak. She said, as though nothing remarkable had occurred, the moss wants scraping from that step. "I shall mention it to the gardener, if you have one still, or find one myself if you do not. You are not going to remark on what nearly happened. What nearly happened, your grace, is that you very sensibly caught your balance on a slippery step, which any person might do, duke or dustman. And I happened to be standing near enough to lend a hand, which is what hands are generally for." She looked up at him, and there was no pity in her face at all, only a kind of matter-of-fact tenderness that undid him far more thoroughly than sympathy would have done. "I do not intend to make a tragedy of every misstep you take between here and the roses. If I did, we should never reach them at all, and I have set my heart on seeing them tonight." They reached the roses. It took the better part of 20 minutes to cover a distance he could once have walked in 2, and by the time they stood among the tangled, thorn-choked beds with the last of the light going violet over the moor, his hip was a single sustained line of fire, and his arm ached from gripping hers, and he did not, for one single step of the whole slow journey, wish himself back in his chair by the fire. You did this, he said quietly, looking at the wilderness of roses he had not seen in 3 years, some still blooming defiantly through the neglect, white and deep red both, climbing where he had once trained them to climb. You asked to see it, knowing I would have to walk the whole way, knowing what it would cost. I asked because I wished to see it, she said, and because I suspected, Your Grace, that you had convinced yourself the distance was impossible, when in truth it was only difficult. And those two things are not the same, however alike they feel from inside a chair by the fire. She reached out and touched, very gently, a spray of white roses gone half wild against a trellis he had built with his own hands a lifetime ago. It has been waiting for you. I think a great deal of this house has been waiting for you, longer than anyone liked to say. He did not answer that. He could not. His throat had closed around something too large for speech. And he stood among the roses with her hand still steadying his arm and watched the lost light drain from the sky and understood, with a clarity that frightened him rather more than the fall on the steps had done, that he was no longer merely grateful to this woman, and had not been for some time. And that gratitude was a far safer feeling than the one now taking its place. The incident at the village fair some days later settled the matter of the speech he had never given, though not in any way he could have planned for. It was Lady Millicent's idea that Fay should go down to Oxshott village for the harvest fair, to see something of the parish she now belonged to and to purchase whatever small comforts a companion's modest wages might stretch to, and Eamon had given his leave without much thought. Glad enough of an excuse to sit alone with his ledgers for an afternoon and remind himself of the ordinary distances that ought to separate a duke from his aunt's companion. He had not accounted for how the afternoon would drag once she was gone from the house, nor how often his eye would stray to the window that overlooked the drive, nor how the ledgers would sit unread in his lap while he waited, with an impatience he despised in himself, for the sound of the returning carriage. It came back later than expected and faster. And Sims burst into the library without knocking, a thing Sims had not done in 3 years, to say there had been trouble in the village, that Miss Nunneley had been caught up in some unpleasantness with the boys from the tannery, and though she was unhurt, she was very shaken. And would his Grace— he was on his feet before Sims finished the sentence, cane forgotten against the chair, and it was only when he reached the hall and the pain shot white and blinding up through his hip that he remembered his own body and its limits. And by then it was too late to turn back for the cane, and he crossed the hall on Will alone, jaw locked against a sound he refused to let escape him, and reached the doors just as the carriage drew up. Fay came down from it white-faced but steady, and behind her the coachman was still muttering about drunken louts and the shame of it, harassing a lady in broad daylight, because she'd stopped to give a coin to old Peg Miller's grandson, and the tannery boys had decided a stranger's kindness to a beggar child was cause for mockery. Nothing worse than shouting and a thrown handful of mud. Thank God, the coachman had seen them off quick enough, but the lady had been frightened badly, anyone could see that. Eamon reached her before Mrs. Pruitt could, before Sims could. Moving without the cane in a way he had not moved in 3 years, and did not think, in that moment, of how it looked or what it cost, only that she was shaking, and there was mud on her sleeve and her eyes when they found his were huge with something that was not. He registered with a jolt. Fear of the tannery boys at all, but astonishment at him crossing the hall unaided, coming to her as he had come to her the very first night. "You're not hurt," he said. It was not quite a question. "No. Only, Your Grace, you're walking, you came without your—" "I am aware of what I came without." He took her arm, more to steady his own trembling legs than hers, though he told himself the reverse, and felt her hand come up to close over his, warm and sure, taking some of his weight without seeming to, without making a display of it. Simply folding her strength into his as though it were the most natural transaction in the world. "Come inside. You're cold." "I am not so cold as you are pale, Your Grace. Sit down, please, before you fall, and do not tell me it does not hurt, for I can see plainly that it does." "It hurts a great deal," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it, and let her lead him to the nearest chair, where he sat heavily and closed his eyes a moment against the pain rioting through his hip, and felt her kneel, actually kneel, on the cold flagstones of his own hall, heedless of her gown, and take his hand between both of hers. You came for me, she said very quietly, when he opened his eyes again. Across the whole of that hall, without your cane, though it was plainly agony to do it. I did not think of the cane. I thought only that you might be hurt. And I could not. He stopped, hearing what he had nearly said, hearing the shape of a confession he was not yet ready to make whole, and saw in her face that she had heard it too, the unfinished half of the sentence hanging between them as plainly as if he had spoken every word. You could not bear it, she finished for him gently, if something had happened to me, and you had been too far away or too proud to come. He did not deny it. He found, kneeling there before her in his own hall with the pain still burning white through his hip, and his housekeeper hovering anxious in the doorway, and half the household gathering to witness a thing they would speak of for years afterward, that he had no denial left in him at all. No, he said, I could not bear it. It was not the declaration either of them was yet ready for. Too much stood between a duke and his aunt's companion for that. Too much grief and pride and 3 years of careful walls not to be dismantled in a single afternoon. But it was... He understood even as he said it, a door standing open where a door had been locked for a very long time, and neither of them moved, for a long moment, to close it again. The letter announcing Lord and Lady Wexford's visit arrived on a Tuesday, and Eamon read it twice through before he set it down with the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had long expected and never quite prepared for regardless. Wexford writes that he means to call Thursday next, he told Mrs. Pruitt, when she came to lay the fire that evening, and that he brings his wife with him. His wife, your grace? Mrs. Pruitt's hands stilled over the coals. She had been housekeeper at Oxshott long enough to require no explanation of what that meant, and he saw her way, visibly, whether to say the name aloud or leave it decently unspoken. Lady Cassandra Wexford, as she has been these 3 years, he said, since someone had to say it, and it might as well be him in his own voice, in his own house, rather than have it whispered around him by servants who thought him too fragile to hear his own history spoken plainly. Yes. That Lady Cassandra. Wexford does not seem to think it worth mentioning that his bringing her here at all might be an unkindness. I dare say it has not occurred to him. He was always a man of good intentions and very little imagination. He did not tell Fay of the letter. He told himself this was simple oversight, that there was no obligation upon him to account to his aunt's companion for every visitor who came to the house, and knew, even as he told himself so, that it was a lie of the plainest kind, that he had not told her because some old, cowardly part of him did not want her to see what he became in Cassandra's presence, did not want the fragile new thing growing between them exposed to the withering comparison of the woman he had once meant to marry, whole and lovely and utterly, correctly right to have left him. Fay learned of it from Nell 3 days later, and came to him in the library with a stillness in her face he had not seen there before. You did not tell me Lord Wexford's wife was once your Lady Cassandra. It did not seem material to your duties. It is not a matter of my duties, your grace, and you know it is not. She sat uninvited in the chair across from his, and there was no softness in her now, only a directness that demanded honesty in return. Why did you not tell me? He set down his pen. There was no deflecting her when she looked at him like that. He had learned that much, at least, in their weeks of stolen afternoons. Because I did not wish you to see me made a fool of in my own house, by a woman who left me for good reason and has never once, in 3 years, given me cause to think ill of her for it. She was right to go, Miss Nunnally. I was not the man she had agreed to marry. I do not blame her for declining to spend her life nursing the ruin of him. You are not a ruin. I am precisely a ruin, and I have made my peace with it, and I do not require. He stopped, hearing the old, worn grievance rising in his own voice, and was ashamed of it. Ashamed to hear himself sound so much like the bitter recluse the village believed him to be, in front of the one person who had never once treated him as though he were that man. Forgive me. I do not wish to quarrel with you over Cassandra Wexford. She is coming Thursday, and there is nothing to be done about it, and I would ask only that you not trouble yourself to be present. There is no reason you should have to witness it. Witness what, precisely? Whatever it is I become in front of her. His jaw tightened. I do not entirely trust myself to remain the man I have been with you, Miss Nunnally. when I am obliged to sit across a table from the woman who watched my face and decided, in the space of a single visit, that she could not love what remained of me. I would rather you did not see that particular version of myself. I am not proud of him. Something moved in Faye's face, not hurt precisely, though he had feared hurt, but a kind of fierce, banked resolve that reminded him forcibly of the night she had refused to leave the gallery. I will be present, Your Grace, because Lady Millicent has asked me to pour the tea, and because I am not in the habit of hiding from difficult afternoons on your behalf or my own. But I will tell you this. Whatever version of yourself you become in that woman's presence, I do not think it will surprise me or frighten me or change one particle of what I have come to think of you these 6 weeks past. I have seen the man underneath the scar and the cane and the temper, Your Grace. I do not believe a single tea tray is going to unmake that discovery. He wanted badly to believe her. He did not entirely manage it before Thursday came. Dr. Alcott called that same Thursday morning, before the Wexfords were expected, to examine the hip and put Eamon through the grinding exercises that were meant to keep the muscle from seizing entire, and he worked in silence for the better part of 20 minutes, testing the range of the joint with a care that had grown, over 3 years, entirely wordless between them. There is more give in it than there was a month ago, Alcott said finally, sitting back on his heels with something like surprise in his face. A good deal more. I would have told you a year past that this was the outer limit of what the leg would ever manage. I begin to think I was wrong. I have been walking further, Eamon admitted. The garden, the long gallery most evenings. So Mrs. Pruitt tells me, though she credits the change to a different physician than myself. Alcott's eyes were shrewd, not unkind, as he packed away his instruments. I do not say this to pry into Your Grace's private affairs. I say it as a man who has watched you decline to for ground you were entirely capable of holding, for 3 years running, out of a grief I understood and did not press you to abandon before you were ready. Whatever has changed these 6 weeks, I am glad of it, for the leg's sake if for no other reason, and if it is not only the leg's sake I have in mind. Alcott was quiet a moment, closing his bag with deliberate care. Then I would say, Your Grace, that a duke may marry where he chooses, and has done so throughout history whenever the choosing pleased him, whatever the county has to say about it after. I would also say that the county has already begun to say a good deal, whether Your Grace has noticed it or not. Mrs. Pruitt's sister keeps the inn, and the inn hears everything, and I am told there is already talk of the Duke of Oxshot's sudden fondness for his aunt's companion. It is not unkind talk mostly, but is talk, and it will grow louder before it grows quieter, and Your Grace ought to know that before you decide how much you care. I find, Eamon said slowly, that I care a great deal less than I once would have. Good, said Alcott, with the ghost of a smile. That, too, is more give than I expected to find, and I am gladder of it than of the hip. The words stayed with him through the whole of the Wexfords' visit that followed, sitting beneath the surface of every exchange like a stone beneath still water, the knowledge that whatever he chose now, chose openly, in his own drawing-room, would not stay contained within these walls, but would travel down to the village and out along the roads to every drawing-room in the county, to be turned over and weighed and, in some quarters, found wanting. He watched Cassandra's careful pity and thought of the harder pity that would come from lesser friends, the raised eyebrows at a duke stooping to marry a parson's penniless daughter, and found, to his own faint astonishment, that the thought no longer frightened him nearly so much as the alternative, a lifetime more of the cold room and the drawn curtains, bought at the price of never again crossing a hall at a run for anyone. Cassandra Wexford had grown, if anything, lovelier in the 3 years since he had last seen her, a fuller, more settled beauty, the beauty of a woman comfortably and happily married, and she came into his drawing-room on her husband's arm with a warmth in her greeting that was, he had to admit even through the old bitterness, entirely genuine. Eamon. She took both his hands, before he could think how to prevent it, and studied his face with an open, searching concern that he recognized at once, with a lurch of old pain as the very same expression she had worn the day they carried him home. You look well. Truly. I had heard such reports. Wexford said you scarcely left your rooms, and I confess I feared. You feared to find me worse than I am. I understand the impulse. I have feared it myself on occasion. He withdrew his hands as soon as courtesy allowed and gestured to a chair, aware, with every nerve, of Fay standing near the tea table in her plain grey gown, watching the whole exchange with a composure he could not read. The visit proceeded. For the better part of an hour, exactly as he had dreaded it would, Wexford filling every silence with hearty, well-meant chatter about hunting and politics and the state of the roads, Cassandra's eyes returning, again and again, to the cane at his side, to the scar at his brow, to the careful economy of his movements, with a concern so plainly tender and so plainly pitying that he felt himself shrinking beneath it, felt the old shame rise up exactly as he had warned Fay it would. "You must let us send our own physician to look at you," Cassandra said gently at one point, leaning forward with her hand nearly touching his sleeve. "Dr. Fenwick has done wonders for old Colonel Ashby's knee, and I cannot bear to think of you shut up here with only country remedies, even when there might be some further help to be had in town." "I am very well attended, Lady Wexford," he said, more sharply than he intended, and saw the flinch cross her face, and hated himself for causing it even as some old, wounded part of him was glad of it. "Of course. Forgive me. I only meant—" Her eyes went unmistakably to the cane again, and then, with an attempt at tact that only made the moment worse, to Fay. "And you are the new companion, I collect, Lady Millicent's girl?" "Fay Nunnally, my lady." Fay's voice, when it came, was perfectly level, perfectly correct, and yet Eamon heard beneath it a thread of steel he recognized well by now. "How good of you to take such a post." Cassandra's smile was kind, entirely without malice, and somehow that made it worse, made it land harder than cruelty would have done. It cannot be an easy household to serve, whatever comforts the position offers otherwise. "I do hope his grace does not tire you too greatly with his moods. He was never an easy man to manage even before, and I imagine his grace has never once tired me," Fay said, still perfectly level, "and I do not think of him as a man to be managed at all. I think of him as a man recovering, by considerable courage, ground that a lesser man would have long since surrendered. Perhaps those who knew him before the war find the comparison painful. I did not have the honor of knowing him before, and so I have the great good fortune of seeing only the man in front of me, who I assure you requires no pity whatsoever." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Wexford cleared his throat and began valiantly to discuss the price of wool. Cassandra's composure did not crack, quite, but something in her face went carefully still, the look of a woman recalculating a comfortable assumption she had not thought to question, and Eamon sat between the two women. The one he had once meant to marry and the one who had, in the space of a single blunt sentence, defended him more fiercely than he had defended himself in 3 years, and felt something in his chest crack open that he had thought permanently sealed. They did not stay long after that. When the carriage had gone and Wexford's cheerful voice had faded down the drive, Eamon found Fay still in the drawing-room, gathering the tea things with hands that were, he noticed, not quite steady now that the audience had departed. "You should not have spoken to her so," he said, though there was no real reproach in it. "She meant no unkindness. I know she meant none. That is precisely why it wanted answering, your grace. Unkindness one may simply endure and dismiss. Pity dressed as kindness is a great deal harder to fight. Because everyone agrees it is well meant, and so a woman is expected to sit and drink her tea and say nothing while it is poured, or a man like cold water, one gentle sentence at a time." She set down the tray with more force than it required. "I could not sit and watch it done to you a moment longer. I am sorry if I embarrassed you." "You did not embarrass me." He crossed to her, without the cane, he realized only after the fact, the movement so unthinking now that he had ceased entirely to count the steps. "You defended me, Miss Nunnally, in my own house, to a woman whose good opinion I once thought I could not live without. And you did it without a single tremor in your voice, though I could see your hands shake the moment she was gone. They are not shaking now, but they were, faintly." And he took one of them in his before he could think better of it, and felt her stillness, felt the breath go out of her, and understood, with a clarity that frightened and steadied him in equal measure, that whatever door had opened in the gallery on the first night, and again among the roses, had just swung fully wide, and there was no honest way left to pretend otherwise to himself or to her. Fay, Her name, unadorned by title, felt enormous in his mouth, a thing he had not permitted himself to say aloud before. I do not know what I am offering you precisely, or whether I have any right to offer it at all. I am not the man she left. I will never again be that man, whole and easy and unafraid of a flight of stairs. But whatever remains of him is yours, if you will have it, more surely than it was ever hers, and I find I can no longer pretend otherwise for the sake of either of our comfort. She looked up at him, and there were tears standing in her eyes now, though she was smiling too, an unsteady, luminous mixture of both. Your Grace, he said, if you are going to refuse me, you may at least do it plainly, by my given name, as you do everything else. I am not going to refuse you. Her hand tightened in his. I only do not know how to say what I feel and have it sound anything less than foolish, 6 weeks into knowing you, Your Grace Eamon, when the whole world would tell me I have lost my senses to feel it so soon. Then do not say it, he said softly, and lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that cost him more than the longest walk to the rose garden had done. Let the world think what it likes of the speed of it. I have waited 3 years to feel anything at all. I do not intend to apologize for feeling it quickly, now that it has finally come. The stable fire began, as such things generally do, with something small and unremarkable, a lantern left too near a heap of dry straw in the tack room, a gust of wind through a carelessly latched door, and it was well alight before anyone in the house so much as smelled the smoke. Eamon was in the library when the shouting started, and for one disorienting moment his mind carried him backward entire, to a field outside a Belgian village, to smoke and noise and the particular helplessness of a man who could not run toward the thing that needed him. Then Sims was in the doorway, white to the lips, saying the stables were ablaze and half the horses trapped, and Miss Nunnally had run out toward the yard the moment she heard the grooms shouting, toward the fire, not away from it. Because old Peg Miller's grandson kept his pony there of an evening and she had gone, God help her, to see the child's animal safely out. He did not remember crossing the hall. He remembered afterward only fragments, the cane left behind entirely, forgotten against the chair the way it had been forgotten once before, the cold night air hitting his lungs like a blow, the orange light thrown high against the low clouds, turning the whole yard the color of a battlefield at dusk, and Faye, small and reckless against that terrible light, wrestling a bridle onto a screaming, wild-eyed pony while smoke rolled black and thick from the stable door behind her, and a support beam, weakened by the flames, groaned audibly overhead. Faye, his voice tore out of him raw, not the flat, correct voice he used for giving household orders, but something older and rougher, dragged up from 3 years buried, and she turned toward the sound of it just as the beam gave behind her, not directly above her, but near enough that the falling timber sent up a fresh gat of sparks and smoke and drove the pony into a screaming, half-mad plunge that knocked her from her feet. He crossed the last 20 yards of that yard faster than he had moved in 3 years, faster, he would think later, than he had believed his ruined legs still capable of carrying him, and the pain when it came was so total, so consuming, that some detached corner of his mind understood he would pay for this for weeks afterward, and found the price entirely, instantly worth it. He reached her as she struggled up out of the churned mud and ash, hauled her clear of the pony's flailing hooves with strength he did not know he still possessed, and got them both 20 more feet from the stable door before the roof gave way behind them with a roar that lit the whole yard white for one blinding instant. Then they were down, both of them, in the mud at the yard's edge, his arms locked around her so tight she could scarcely breathe, and the world was noise and smoke and shouting grooms and the screaming of horses being led, one by one, out through the stable's far door to safety, and none of it mattered at all beside the fact of her, whole and warm and breathing against his chest, coughing smoke but breathing alive. You are a fool, he said into her hair, when he could speak at all, his voice wrecked with smoke and terror, and something that was neither. A reckless, magnificent fool, running toward a burning building for a child's pony. He would have grieved that pony his whole life, Faye said, muffled against his coat, her own voice thick with smoke and tears both. I could not simply stand by and, your leg, you came the whole way without. I did not think of the leg, He drew back far enough to look at her face, streaked with ash, her hair come loose entirely from its pins, and found her, in that ruined state, more beautiful than he had ever seen anything in his life. I did not think of anything at all, Faye, except that you were there and the roof was coming down and I could not lie still and watch it happen. Not again. Not to you. Understanding moved across her face, the shape of what he had not said aloud, his brother, the mud, the 8 feet he could not cross, and her hand came up to his cheek, gentle against the suit and the old scar both. You did not lie still, she said softly. You came. Whatever it cost you, whatever it will cost you tomorrow, you came, and you are the last man in England anyone would dare call broken if they had seen what I have just seen. Around them the yard was slowly settling into the grim business of counting losses, the tack room gutted. One wall of the stable collapsed entire, but every horse accounted for and safe in the paddock beyond, and Peg Miller's grandson's pony among them, trembling but whole, and not a single soul hurt beyond smoke and scrapes, and the general shaking that follows a near thing survived. Mrs. Prewitt was already organizing blankets and brandy with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had waited 3 years for a crisis to prove her household's mettle and meant to prove it thoroughly now the chance had come. It was only when the immediate danger had passed, when Faye had been wrapped in a blanket and pressed into a chair by the kitchen fire over her own protests that she was not so fragile as all that the cost of the last 10 minutes finally caught up with him entire. He felt his leg go first. Not the ordinary ache he had learned to carry through every day for 3 years, but something sharper, more total, a white-hot seizing through the whole ruined length of muscle from hip to knee. And he had just enough warning to reach for the door frame before the strength went out of him altogether, and he went down hard against the kitchen flagstones, the room tilting and darkening at its edges. He heard Faye's cry as though from a great distance, heard Mrs. Prewitt shouting for Sims, felt hands, several sets of hands, gathering him up and half carrying him toward the nearest chair, and through all of it, dim and swimming, he was aware of only one thing with any real clarity. Faye's face above his, white with fear, her hand gripping his so hard it hurt, and her voice, breaking entirely now, saying his name over and over as though the repetition alone might hold him to consciousness. Stay with me, she was saying. Emon, stay with me, do you hear? Dr. Alcott is sent for, only stay with me, please. I cannot, after everything, I cannot lose you to a fall in your own kitchen when you have just walked through fire for a stranger's pony and for me. I am not going anywhere, he managed, though the words came thick and slow, the pain a roaring tide he was fighting to speak over. I have only just found my way back into the world, Faye Nunnally. I do not intend to leave it again so soon, and certainly not before I have said properly what I meant, the very first night, when I said you were mine. Her breath caught, even half insensible with pain, he saw it catch, saw her eyes fill. I did not mean it then as anything more than a man catching a falling stranger. He went on, forcing the words out though the room kept trying to slide sideways around him. I know that now. But I have thought on it every day since, and I find the words have grown truer than I ever intended them to be, and I would have you know it before Alcott arrives and dopes me with laudanum, and I forget my own courage entire. You are mine, Faye. Not because you fell into my arms, and not out of any duty or gratitude either. Because I have watched you run toward burning buildings and defend me to duchesses and read Cowper abominably 3 afternoons a week for 6 weeks running, and I do not want the rest of my life to pass without you in the whole of it. Eamon, her voice broke entirely now, tears cutting clean tracks through the ash on her cheeks. You are agony, and half out of your senses with it, and this is no time. It is the only time I have ever been honest enough to say it properly, he said, and managed, through the pain, something that was almost a smile. Say something back to me, Faye, before Alcott's laudanum takes the memory of your answer from me entirely. I love you, she said, without a single hesitation, the words coming out on a sob of relief and terror and joy all tangled together. I have loved you, I think, since the very night I fell through your doors and you rose from that chair as though the whole of your body had forgotten it was meant to be broken. I do not care what the county says, or what Lady Cassandra thinks, or how it looks for a duke to marry his aunt's companion. I love you, and I am not going anywhere either, whatever it costs either of us to say so out loud. He held on to that, held on to the words and her hand both through the worst of what came after, through Alcott's arrival and the grim examination and the laudanum that finally, mercifully, dragged him down into a darkness too deep for pain to follow. And in that darkness, for the first time in 3 years, he did not dream of mud or grape shot, or his brother's still body 8 unreachable feet away. He dreamed of a rose garden gone wild, and a woman's hand steadying his arm and roses blooming defiantly through neglect, waiting, as she had said, for someone to come. He woke past noon the following day to sunlight and a bandaged hip and the peculiar, hollowed lightness that follows both laudanum and terror once both have run their course, and found Faye asleep in the chair beside his bed, still in yesterday's soot-marked gown, her head tipped uncomfortably against the wing of the chair, her hand still loosely curled around his where it had evidently remained through the whole of the night. He watched her a long while before he woke her, unwilling to surrender even a moment of the sight. This woman who had run toward a fire for a stranger's pony, who had knelt in his hall and held his hand while duchesses looked on, who had said, without a single hesitation, that she loved him, in the middle of a kitchen with the smell of smoke still thick in the air. "You are staring," she said, without opening her eyes, and he laughed, startled, delighted, the sound still unfamiliar enough in his own throat to catch him by surprise each time it came. "I am admiring. There is a difference." She opened her eyes then, and the smile that broke over her face at finding him awake and lucid, and looking at her exactly as he was looking at her, undid something in his chest all over again. "How do you feel?" As though a horse trod the length of my hip and then, for good measure, sat upon it. "Alcott tells me I have set my recovery back a full season, and ought by rights to be furious with myself." He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers properly together. "I find I cannot manage even the smallest fraction of fury. I would do it again tomorrow, exactly as I did last night, and count the season well spent." "You are not to do anything of the kind again," she said, with a sternness that did not remotely disguise the tears standing fresh in her eyes. "I have had quite enough of watching you fall on flagstones for one lifetime, your grace." "Eamon," he corrected gently, "you said it plainly enough last night in the kitchen, before Alcott's laudanum took me under. I have not forgotten a word of it, whatever you feared." Colour rose in her face, but she did not look away. "I remember every word of it too. Word of the fire, and of what the Duke of Oxshott had done in the midst of it, had already begun its journey down to the village by the time Lady Millicent came to sit with them that afternoon, moving slower than her usual brisk pace, her eyes suspiciously bright. "The whole parish is talking of nothing else," she announced, settling herself into the second chair with the air of a woman well satisfied with the world's proceedings. "Peg Miller has been at the kitchen door since dawn with a basket of her best eggs, weeping and blessing your name, nephew. And I am told the blacksmith means to stand you a tankard the next time you show your face in the village, which I collect you have not done in 3 years, and which I mean to see corrected directly you are fit to travel that far in a curricle." She looked between the two of them, at their joined hands, at the colour still high in Faye's cheeks, and her shrewd old face softened entire. "And I understand there is rather more to celebrate than a rescued pony. Aunt, do not aunt me in that warning tone, Eamon Thorne. As though I have not watched this happening beneath my own roof for 6 weeks and held my tongue admirably throughout, out of respect for your own stubborn pride working itself out in its own stubborn time." Lady Millicent reached over and patted free hand with unmistakable affection. "I could not have chosen better for him myself, child, and I have had opinions on the matter of his marrying since he was in short coats, so you may take that as the compliment it is meant to be." "Thank you, my lady," Faye said, laughing despite the tears still standing in her eyes. "Though I confess I have given very little thought yet to what marrying a duke would actually require of me, beyond loving him, which has proved remarkably little trouble by comparison. It will require rather more than you imagine, I'm afraid, whatever your heart tells you now," Lady Millicent said, and something careful crept back into her voice, the shrewdness reasserting itself over the warmth. "The county will not all receive it as I have. There are those who will say a great deal about a parson's daughter reaching so far above her station, and worse, I am sorry to say, about a duke settling, their word not mine, for less than his rank once commanded given his condition. I do not say this to discourage either of you. I say it because I have lived a good deal longer than you both, and I know precisely how loud the world can be when it disapproves of a happiness it was not consulted about. Eamon's hand tightened around Faye's. Let them be loud, aunt. I spent 3 years listening to a silence of my own making. I find I have grown rather fond of noise, provided it is noise made over something worth defending. It was, he would think later, a fine and confident thing to say, sitting warm and safe in his own bed with Faye's hand in his and his aunt's blessing freshly given. He did not yet know how soon, and how sharply, that confidence would be tested, for even as Lady Millicent spoke, a letter was already making its way up the drive from the receiving office in the village, addressed in a cramped, unfamiliar hand to His Grace the Duke of Oxshott, from a cousin twice removed named Josiah Ashcombe, who had, until that very morning, expected in the fullness of time to inherit a great deal more than a common courtesy title, and who had just that week received a piece of county gossip that threatened, in his own careful estimation, to cost him everything he had spent years quietly waiting for. Mr. Josiah Ashcombe arrived at Oxshott 8 days later, by which time Eamon was walking again, slowly and with the cane he no longer troubled to hide, and the whole county had, by Lady Millicent's cheerful reckoning, talked itself hoarse over the tale of the Duke who had walked through fire for a stranger's pony, and it was now generally agreed, for his aunt's companion besides. Josiah was a narrow, careful man of perhaps 40, dressed a shade too finely for a country visit, and he came into the drawing-room with the particular smile of a man who has rehearsed his opening remarks the whole length of a long carriage ride, and means to deliver them regardless of how the conversation actually unfolds. Cousin, you look remarkably well, all things considered. The county's reports had led me to expect rather worse. His eyes moved cataloguing over the cane, the room, and finally, with unmistakable and undisguised interest, to Faye, seated with her needlework near the window. And this will be the young person the gossips have been so occupied with. Miss Nunnerly, is it? Lady Millicent's companion. Miss Nunnerly, Eamon said, with a flatness that would have warned off any man paying proper attention, is shortly to be my wife, Josiah, and I would thank you to address her as such. To his credit, Josiah did not gape, though the effort of composing his face cost him a visible moment. Ah. So the reports were accurate after all. I confess I had hoped the county exaggerated, as it so often does. Say plainly what you have come to say. You did not travel 40 miles to admire my recovering health. Josiah's smile thinned, the rehearsed pleasantries abandoned for something more honest, if no more welcome. Very well, cousin, since you press me to it. I have come because I stand, as you well know, next in the entail after your own issue, and have done since poor Robert died at Waterloo alongside you, God rest him. I have made my peace this long while, with the likelihood that I would one day inherit, given your, forgive me the plainness, but you have invited it, given your circumstances, which the whole county believed, until a fortnight past, precluded any thought of marriage or heirs. I do not say this unkindly. I say it because a man is entitled to some notice before the whole shape of his expectations is overturned by a duke's sudden fondness for a parson's penniless daughter, met not 2 months since. You are entitled to nothing of the kind, Eamon said, very quietly. And I would remind you, cousin, that my circumstances, as you so delicately put it, are my own to bear and my own to build a life around, and no relation's convenience, however long anticipated, has ever once entered into my reckoning of what that life should contain. You cannot mean to marry her. Josiah's composure was cracking now, the careful smile gone entirely, something more anxious and more honest showing beneath it. A companion, Eamon, a woman with no fortune, no connections worth the name, nothing to recommend the match beyond, I am told, a certain gentleness of manner that half the county now credits with your recovery, as though you were a wound she has bandaged rather than a man making his own choices. Think what is said of it. Think what will be said of her, and of you, and of any children such a match might produce, always under the shadow of having married so far beneath. Enough. Eamon rose without the cane's assistance, though the movement cost him, and Faye's needlework had long since gone still in her lap, her eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that steadied something in his chest, even as Josiah's words worked to unsettle it. "You will not speak of Miss Nunnally's worth in my hearing again, cousin, in any tone, on any pretext. She ran into a burning building for a stable boy's pony, while the rest of this county sat safe in their drawing rooms discussing the weather. She has sat with me through pain that would have driven a lesser soul from the room, and she has never once, in the whole of our acquaintance, asked me for anything beyond my honesty, which is a great deal more than I can say for anyone the county would consider a suitable match." Josiah's mouth worked, some further argument rising, and then, under the weight of Eamon's expression, dying unspoken. "I only meant to spare you both a difficult season, cousin. Society will not forget so easily as you seem to believe. Then society may remember as long as it pleases," Eamon said. "I have spent 3 years arranging my whole existence around what society expected of a broken man, Josiah, and I have found, this past fortnight, that I would rather be whole and disgraced in a dozen drawing rooms than careful and half alive in this one for 1 hour longer. You may tell whoever asks that the Duke of Oxshott has made his choice, and made it with his eyes entirely open, and does not require anyone's blessing to stand by it." Josiah left within the hour, cold and formal in his farewells. And Eamon watched the carriage go down the long drive with a hollow, unsettled feeling he could not entirely account for, not regret precisely, but the aftershock of a battle fought and won at some cost he had not yet finished counting. Lady Millicent found him still standing at the window some minutes later, and did not trouble to pretend she had not overheard the greater part of the exchange. "He was always a small man, your cousin Josiah, whatever the width of his coat," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I do not say that to comfort you, nephew, though I hope it does. I say it because small men make a great deal of noise about entitlements they never actually possessed, and Josiah Ashcombe was never entitled to this house, this title, or 1 hour of your consideration. He was entitled only to wait, as heirs presumptive have always waited, and hope, and he does not care to be told that hoping was the whole of his claim. He was not entirely wrong, aunt, about what the county will say." "No," Lady Millicent agreed, with the same unflinching honesty she had offered from the first day of Faye's arrival. "He was not wrong that there will be talk, and some of it unkind, and a season, perhaps 2, of drawing rooms that receive you both with rather more curiosity than warmth. But I have lived 71 years in this county, Eamon, and I will tell you what I have learned in that time. Society forgives almost anything, in the end, that is carried off with sufficient confidence and a happy marriage to show for it. It is uncertainty the drawing rooms cannot forgive, a duke skulking behind curtains, a match entered into with apology in every line of the settlement. Marry her boldly, and be seen to be happy in it, and I promise you the whispers will exhaust themselves within a 12-month, for want of anything scandalous left to feed on." He looked down at his aunt, this sharp, tired old woman who had kept her own lonely vigil in this house for 3 years alongside his, and found himself, unexpectedly embracing her, an unfamiliar gesture between them, stiff with dessous and all the more valuable for it. "Thank you, aunt, for Faye. For not once in 6 weeks, treating either of us as anything less than sensible adults capable of choosing our own happiness." "Someone in this house needed to," Lady Millicent said, though her eyes were suspiciously bright, "and heaven knows you were both too busy falling in love to notice you required a chaperone's blessing at all. Go on. I believe you'll find her in the garden." She went out not 10 minutes past, looking very much like a woman who needed either solitude or reassurance, and I have found in my long life that a man is generally the better remedy for the second, provided he does not dawdle finding her. He found Faye in the rose garden that evening, alone among the wild-grown beds in the last of the light, and something in the set of her shoulders told him, before she turned, that Josiah's visit had left its mark on her as surely as it had on him. "You heard all of it," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I heard enough." Mrs. Prewitt did not think to close the drawing-room door entirely. She did not look at him, her fingers moving restlessly over a spray of white roses gone thorny with neglect. "He was not wrong, Eamon, whatever else he was. I have no fortune, no connections worth the name. I am a parson's daughter with nothing to recommend me but a willingness to speak plainly and a stubborn refusal to be frightened off. And half the county will look at our marriage and see exactly what your cousin sees, a duke settling for less than his rank commands, because his condition, as everyone so delicately calls it, has narrowed his choices to whatever kindness happened to fall through his door in a storm. Is that what you believe I have done? Settled. I believe it is what will be said, whatever the truth of it, and I find I cannot entirely bear the thought of you paying that price for my sake. The whispers, the cold shoulders in drawing rooms you have only just found the courage to think of entering again, the certainty that every smile turned your way will carry some private calculation about what you might have had before the war, before all of this. Her voice caught. I love you, Eamon. I have not doubted that for one single hour since the kitchen, but I have begun to wonder, these past days, whether loving you rightly means loving you enough to release you from a match that will cost you dearly among the very people whose good opinion you are only now learning to want again. He turned her gently to face him, one hand coming up to cradle her jaw with a tenderness that belied the sudden, fierce urgency in his voice. Faye, look at me. Do you know what I was the night you fell through my door? A duke who had not risen from his chair in 3 years. A dead man who had simply not yet been buried. The words came hard, but he did not soften them. She deserved the whole truth, not a gentled version of it. I sat in that room, and I let the world believe whatever it liked of me, be beast, cripple, recluse, because it cost me nothing to let it believe those things. Grief had made a coward of me, Faye, however bravely I had once borne a sabre and grape-shot both. I was frightened of failing in front of people who remembered what I had been, and so I chose never to be seen failing at all, which is its own particular kind of cowardice, dressed up as dignity. He drew a breath. You did not give me that choice. You fell through my door and forced me to rise before I had time to remember I wasn't meant to, and every day since, you have asked more of me than 3 years of careful management ever dared to ask, to walk further, to laugh again, to run into a burning yard without counting the cost first. If that is settling, Faye Nunnally, then I have never in my life been so glad to settle for anything. And the whispers, the county, your cousin, and the next one after him, and every drawing room that will wonder aloud why the Duke of Oxshott married so far beneath. Let them wonder. He tilted her face up to his thumb tracing gentle across her cheek. I told Josiah this afternoon that I would rather be whole and disgraced than careful and half alive, and I meant every word of it, Faye, not as a fine speech for my cousin's benefit, but as the truest thing I know. I do not want a careful marriage to a suitable stranger who will look at this scar and this leg with the same practiced pity Cassandra once wore so well. I want a wife who runs into fires. I want a wife who reads Cowper abominably and defends me to duchesses and kneels on cold flagstones without a thought for her own gown. Whatever it costs among people whose opinion I have already told you I no longer prize above yours, I will pay it 1,000 times over, gladly, for the rest of my life, if you will only agree to be standing beside me while I pay it. The tears that had been standing in her eyes finally spilled over, but she was smiling now entire, the doubt of a moment before burned away by the plain, unanswerable certainty in his voice. You make it very difficult to argue the sensible course, Your Grace. Good, he said, and drew her against him among the wild roses, in the last gold light of an evening that had begun, only hours before, with a cousin's cold arithmetic, and now ended with nothing in the world weighed against her at all. I have had quite enough of sensible courses. I intend to spend what remains of my life on rather better ones. He reached, then, into his waistcoat pocket, and drew out a ring he had carried there for 3 days without finding the courage to offer it, his mother's ring, a small, old-fashioned band of gold set with a single dark garnet, warm now from being carried so near his heart. I meant to do this properly, he said, feeling suddenly absurdly young, a man of 35 fumbling over words he had rehearsed a dozen times and forgotten entirely the moment they were wanted. On one knee I had thought, though I confess the leg makes something of a joke of the gesture these days, and I find I do not much care whether it is done properly so long as it is done at all. Faye Nunnally, you fell through my door on the worst night of a very long winter, and you have not once, in all the weeks since, treated me as anything less than a whole man worth the falling. Will you marry me? Not out of pity, and not out of duty to your post here, but because I love you more plainly and more entirely than I believed myself still capable of loving anything, and I find the rest of my life makes very little sense to me unless you are standing in the middle of it. She looked at the ring and at his face, and whatever careful reservations Josiah's visit had planted in her that afternoon seemed, in that moment, to dissolve entirely, burned away by the plain wonder in her eyes. Yes, she said, and then, laughing through fresh tears, yes, Eamon, 1,000 times yes, and you may put it on properly whether your leg objects or not, for I find I am rather fond of gestures, however much they cost you. He laughed too, that same rusty, unpracticed sound, grown less rusty with each week's practice, and slid the ring onto her finger with hands that were, for once, entirely steady, and kissed her there among the roses as the last light went out of the sky and the first stars came up over Oxshot's old stone roofline, and neither of them thought once, in that gathering dark, of Josiah Ashcombe or the county's whispers or anything at all beyond the warm, astonishing fact of each other. It was Lady Millicent, the next morning over breakfast, who raised the question neither of them had yet considered. You cannot simply marry quietly and hope the county forgets to notice, she said, buttering her toast with brisk efficiency. There is the autumn assembly at Oxshott Village Hall in a fortnight. The whole parish will be there, and half the county besides, and I think, nephew, that the very best answer to every whisper Josiah Ashcombe carries back to his own drawing-room would be for the Duke of Oxshott to walk into that hall on his betrothed's arm, in front of every soul who ever called you beast or broken behind your back, and dance. Eamon set down his cup and felt for the first time in 3 years something that was not dread at the thought of a crowded room, but a fierce, unfamiliar readiness. I have not danced since before the war, Aunt. I am not entirely certain the leg will permit it. Then you will have a fortnight to discover whether it will, Lady Millicent said, unmoved, and I do not believe, having watched you cross a burning yard at a dead run a week past, that a country dance holds any terror left for you at all. Across the table, Faye's eyes met his, bright with the same fierce readiness, and he understood, looking at her, that whatever the assembly hall held in store, curious stares, cold civility, the particular scrutiny reserved for a duke who had dared to choose happiness over caution, he would rather face every bit of it with her hand in his than spend one more hour hiding from a world he had at last remembered how to want. The village hall at Oxshott had not seen the Duke's shadow fall across its threshold in 3 years, and every soul within it seemed to know it the instant he appeared in the doorway, for the fiddler's tune faltered, and the low hum of gossip died all at once, and 200 faces turned as one toward the man standing there in his dark coat with his betrothed on his arm and his cane in his other hand, entirely unhidden. He felt the old instinct rise in him at once, the pull toward retreat, toward the safety of a closed door and a distant chair, and he felt, just as immediately, Faye's hand tighten on his arm, steady and sure, and heard her voice, pitched only for him, beneath the settling silence. They are only people, Eamon. You have faced worse than curious stares, and come through it standing. He walked forward. It cost him something, that walk across the hall's scrubbed wooden floor, the cane marking each step, the whole room's attention of physical weight against his back, and he did not hurry it, did not attempt to disguise the limp that 3 years of hiding had never once managed to erase. He simply walked at his own pace, with his head up and Faye beside him, and by the time they reached the far side of the hall where the vicar and old Connell Ashby stood waiting to greet them, the silence had begun of its own accord to break apart into something warmer. It was Peg Miller who broke it entire, small, weathered Peg Miller, whose grandson's pony now grazed safe and sound in the Oxshott paddock, who came forward from the crowd without a shred of the deference the county generally observed toward a duke, and took his free hand in both of hers with tears standing plain in her eyes. Your Grace, her voice carried, cracked and clear, to every corner of the suddenly hushed hall. I never had the chance to thank you properly for what you did that night. My boy's pony is all he has left of his father, God rest him, and you walked into a burning building on a leg the whole county said would never carry you further than your own drawing-room, and you saved it, and near killed yourself doing it. I don't care what any of the fine folks in this hall have said of you these 3 years past, behind their fans and their good manners. I know what I saw." A murmur ran through the room at that, not unkind. He registered with something like disbelief, but something closer to shame, the particular discomfort of people confronted, gently but unmistakably, with the smallness of their own gossip. Colonel Ashby, a bluff old soldier who had fought in an earlier war and understood better than most what a wound like Eamon's truly cost, stepped forward next and gripped his hand with a soldier's plain respect. "Good to see you standing, Oxshott." "Damned good to see it, if you'll forgive an old man's plain speech in front of the ladies." He glanced past Eamon's shoulder to where Fay stood, colour high in her cheeks, and inclined his head toward her with unmistakable approval. "And this will be the young lady who's had rather more to do with it than any of Alcott's lineaments, if half the parish's talk is to be believed. My compliments, Miss Nunnally. It takes a particular courage to love a man the world has already decided to write off, and a particular blindness to good sense besides, which I mean, in this instance, as the very highest compliment I know how to pay." The evening turned, after that, the way a tide turns, slowly at first, and then all at once, until the hall that had gone silent his entrance was, within the hour, filled with the ordinary noise of a country assembly, fiddle music and laughter and the scrape of chairs, and more than one soul who had, 3 years past, whispered beast in a servant's hearing, now finding excuses to approach him directly, to ask after his health with something that had shed its pity and become instead plain neighbourly interest. He did not dance that night. The leg, however willing his heart had grown, was not yet equal to that particular ambition, whatever Lady Millicent's brisk confidence had predicted. But he stood at the edge of the floor with Fay's hand in his and watched the dancing, and found that standing there, seen and unhidden, cost him rather less than he had feared and gave him rather more than he had dared to hope. "You are smiling," Fay observed some while later, when the fiddler had paused to catch his breath and the floor had cleared for a moment's rest. "I am discovering I have missed rooms full of noise rather more than I let myself remember." He looked down at her, at the candlelight catching gold in her hair, at the ring on her finger that had been his mother's and was now. He understood with a fullness that still occasionally caught him unprepared, going to be Fay's for the whole of the rest of her life. "I have missed a great many things these 3 years, and I find I did not fully know the shape of the missing until you fell through my door and gave me no choice but to feel it all again." "I did not give you the choice, precisely," she said, smiling. "I only fell, your grace. You did the rest yourself, one difficult step at a time, and I merely happened to be standing near enough to lend a hand when the steps grew too steep to manage alone." "That," he said, "is a very modest account of a woman who ran into a burning stable, defended me to a duchess, and told my own cousin to his face that I required no pity whatsoever. You have never once, in the whole of our acquaintance, merely happened to do anything, Fay Nunnally. You have chosen it, every time, deliberately, when it would have been a great deal easier to look away." She did not argue the point further, only leaned her head against his shoulder, there in the candlelit hall with the fiddle music starting up again and 200 neighbours slowly, surely, remembering how to look at their duke without flinching, and neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to stand together in the noise and the warmth of a room that had, not so long ago, felt entirely close to them both. They were married in November in the small stone church at Oxshott village, with the last of the autumn roses, cut at Fay's insistence from the wild garden that had waited so long for someone to tend it, arranged in great armfuls along the altar rail. Lady Millicent wept openly through the whole of the ceremony and claimed loudly afterward to have caught a chill in the draughty church, which fooled no one in attendance, least of all Mrs. Prewitt, who wept just as openly and made no pretence at all of a chill to explain it. Eamon walked the length of the aisle without his cane. He had not planned it, precisely, had woken that morning fully intending to use it, as he used it most days still, without shame or concealment, but standing at the church door with the whole parish turned to watch him come. And Fay waiting at the altar in a gown the colour of the last cream roses, something him had simply refused the cane's assistance, not out of pride this time, nor out of the old, frightened need to appear whole in front of witnesses, but out of a plain, fierce wish to walk the whole of that distance toward her on his own 2 feet, whatever it cost him afterward, because some things a man wanted to do unaided, once in his life, for no reason beyond the wanting, it cost him a great deal. His hip burned by the time he reached her, and his hand was not quite steady when he took hers before the vicar, and he did not care in the slightest, because she was smiling at him with an entire, unguarded joy that made every step of the distance worth twice its price. "You walked the whole way," she whispered, as the vicar arranged his book and the church settled into its expectant hush. "I found I wanted to arrive at you under my own power," he whispered back, "just this once. You may scold me for it later, when the pain sets in properly, and I promise to accept the cane's help most humbly for the rest of the day. I have no intention of scolding you," she said, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide. "I intend to remember this exact moment for the whole of my life." Eamon Thorne, the Duke of Oxshott, walking unaided down the aisle of his own church, toward a wife nobody expected him to have, and everybody, by the end, was glad to see him win. They spoke their vows in voices that carried clear through the small church, and when the vicar pronounced them married, Eamon did not for any cue or custom to kiss his wife before the whole assembled parish, his hand cradling her face with the same gentleness he had used months before to catch a falling stranger in a storm-lashed hall, and the church erupted into a warmth of applause and tears that followed them the whole way back down the aisle and out into the pale November sunshine. That evening, after the wedding breakfast had run its long, happy course and the last of the guests had gone home well fed and well satisfied with the day's proceedings, Eamon found his wife. His wife, a word he suspected he would go on marvelling at for years to come, standing once more among the wild roses, now nearly bare with the seasons turning, a shawl drawn close against the evening chill. "You are always to be found in this garden," he said, coming to stand beside her, his cane in hand now, the day's unaided effort having earned him, he had decided, the right to lean on it without a single pang of the old shame. "I begin to think you love it better than you love the house itself. I love what it taught me," she said, leaning into his shoulder as his arm came around her. "That a thing left untended for long enough does not stop being beautiful. It only waits, quietly, doing what it was always capable of doing, until someone troubles to come and see it properly." She turned in the circle of his arm to look up at him, at the scar still pale across his brow, at the eyes that had, over these past months, lost every trace of the guarded darkness they'd held the first night she fell through his door. "I did not fall in love with a beast that night, Eamon, whatever the county once called you, and I did not fall in love with a broken man either, whatever you called yourself. I fell in love with a man who was simply waiting, the way this garden waited, for someone to come and see what was there all along. Then I am glad, beyond anything I have words to properly say, that it was you who came," he said, and bent to kiss her there among the lost roses of the year, unhurried, unwatched, certain in a way he had not believed himself capable of being certain of anything again. He rose that night and every night after, from whatever chair he happened to be sitting in, whenever she entered a room, not because his leg had been miraculously mended, for it had not, and never fully would be, and he had long since made his peace with the cane he would carry the whole of his days. He rose because some things a man's heart insisted upon regardless of what his body cost him for the effort, and because he had learned, in the space of one extraordinary storm-tossed autumn, that the truest thing he had ever said to her had been the very first thing, spoken before he understood its weight, proven true 100 times over in every season that followed, and meant now at last exactly as it sounded. She was his. He was entirely, gladly hers. And whatever the world had once believed of the beast of Oxshott, the whole county now knew the truer story, of a wounded man who had found, in the tenderness of one falling stranger, every reason in the world to rise.